The world is complex, the Bible is complex. Human existence is a tangled ball of experience, perception, and understanding. Ravel is a puzzling word, denoting both a tangling and untangling. This podcast attempts to hold honest conversations in good faith. Some ideas expressed in this podcast will be challenging. Others will be obvious. When a PhD in biblical interpretation and a habitually podcasting man-child discuss matters of society, scripture, and scandal, you get Ravel.
Hey everybody, you are listening to Ravel, and it's me, your best buddy Basil. And with me, as always, the radical revelator, the prophetic pontificator, and the Earl of the End. It's Dr. Christopher Ryan Gates. Hey buddy.
Hello. I know that I chuckle at these, but it's sometimes because they're funny, usually just because of how creative they are. And I know for a fact that you put this one together in about 5 seconds. So
I'm getting pretty good, man. I'm getting pretty speedy. It used to be like a 15-minute process before the show of just me quietly typing and looking up the thesaurus online, thesaurus.com, trying to craft the perfect set of, what's the word? Superlatives, yes. Yeah. So, anywho, but I find them all very relevant, and I think you do too. Today, we've got an interesting situation. It would not come as a surprise to anybody who has followed my work for a decade now, to learn that because of me entirely, there's been a slight whoopsie doodles in scheduling. You did a wonderful job of scheduling, doing the administrative work on this here podcast, and I just didn't. And so this is going to be a wonderful conversation between you, Dr. Christopher Ryan Gates, and the very talented, longtime friend of mine, Derek Gilbert.
Yeah. Man, it's hard getting. We're just working here at the church today with the worship team, and it's so very difficult getting everyone's schedules together to get all of them together for practice. And it's because everybody's so busy all the time, and it happens sometimes. And you had a conflict of interest there. So yeah.
There are some fiduciary conflicts of interest. I actually have a long-standing contract. I have a legal, what is it called when you can't go near somebody? I forget.
Restraining order?
Restraining order. I have a Skype restraining order from Derek Gilbert.
Oh boy, yeah.
No, just kidding. Yeah. So actually, this is going to be. You are going to be taking the reins after this intro, because I have to skedaddle, and go off and fulfill some responsibilities that I had mixed up for tonight. So
yeah. I don't know if this makes you very responsible or irresponsible. I'm trying to weigh the two.
That's the thing, man. We were having this conversation before we started recording, and I told you the problem that I'm having, which is like, I'm in a no-win situation right now. No matter what, I'm letting someone down. And you just gotta balance that out sometimes. But you were very gracious, and you volunteered as tribute, and not just you, but you volunteered all of our listeners as tribute. Yeah. to suffer the consequences. Now, I think, look, I get a lot of mail, email, thank God, with, let's just say, a variety of different opinions about me and how people feel about my job that I do. Mm-hmm. And, I think this fits because recently there's been just a slight uptick in people not wanting to hear so much of me.
Oh, gosh.
So,
oh, man.
Yeah, I know. But that's okay. I've grown thick skin over the years, and I think this might just be the Holy Spirit's timing. People are done hearing from me, and I think especially in this conversation with you and Derek, two intellectual powerhouses, I think that's just the way it should be. You don't need some goofball coming in making unnecessary comments and goofs and japes and bringing up pesky questions that you theological masterminds need to deal with. So
yeah,
we're just going to let you guys run wild.
Get out of the way, dummy.
Get out of the way, regular uncredentialed question asker.
Oh, man. Yeah, no. That's you are quite an asset to all the conversations, and you're not.
Oh, goodness,
you're
Chris.
Not a dummy. I said it in jest, but you downplay, I think, your contribution and intelligence sometimes. But I very much appreciate you.
Well, thank you very much. This is what happens when you live through a decade of pretty much an even split of fan mail and hate mail. You learn how to position yourself in the correct way as to, sometimes you got to give the haters a second. You got to let them see what it would be like without me there, and hope that they don't enjoy it too much. So, anywho, that's what's going to happen. We're talking to Derek Gilbert. Like I said, if you've followed my work over the years, you've heard plenty of me and Derek talking. So I'm excited to hear these two wonderful gentlemen in my life go off and explore the outer rim of theology and how it intersects with current events, as well as some of the more fringy concepts, both biblical, extra biblical, etc. Now, we've had some requests for talks like this recently. Is that right?
Yeah. We haven't actually really tackled a full episode on really the end times or even the book of Revelation. So, just looking at some of the interpretive issues that are there, I think a lot of people might be surprised to find out that there are different ways to approach the book of Revelation. There's a pretty standard view that I think most people have, there's more to it than that. So we haven't actually really gotten into that on the show yet. So this will be a really good opportunity for a lot of people to hear some of the different angles, and then of course Derek's angle on it too, which is fascinating, of course. So kind of a first for us here.
Indeed. Well, I'm looking forward to it, and I'm sitting here in our email box, and it looks like Derek's ready to come on. So we are going to hang up this call, and we are going to pick up on another call. And by the time you catch back up, listeners, I will be gone. So enjoy the time, as I know I will, and see you on the other side.
Well, I'm here with Derek Gilbert. Basil has fled the coop here. He's run off on us.
He's fleeing the interview. He's fleeing the interview.
Yeah, you intimidated him. You scared him away. But yes, Derek Gilbert, excited to have you on. I have been, I have followed your work for many years now, actually, and very excited to be here talking with you. Kind of actually appreciate the fact that it'll just be you and I, because Basil, he just has a tendency to occupy so much of the conversation sometimes. So it's great to have you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. It is an honor to be here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It's an honor to have you. And this is the first time that we've talked in such a forum, but we actually have had a little bit of banter previously because we are in the same fantasy baseball league, which I didn't know. You're a big baseball fan. Is this the case?
Yeah, I grew up in Chicago, and I grew up in an era before video games. So when we played baseball, football, hockey, basketball, it was on the playground at the school across the street. And you grew up in Chicago in the late 60s, and that was the era of Fergie Jenkins and Ron Santo, Ernie Banks, Don Kessinger, Glenn Beckert, Randy Hundley. I still remember the 1969 lineup.
Wow.
Basically,
Still my heart.
You basically set the lineup and just let it roll every day. Kessinger, Beckert, Williams, Santo, Banks, Hundley, and then whoever played center field and right field, which was a kind of a rotating cast because they never really had anybody good to play those outfield spots. But the starting rotation, I mean, Fergie Jenkins, Kenny Holtzman, Bill Hands, and then
This is, well, for anybody who doesn't know, this is the Cubs he's talking about. You said Chicago, and of course, I also a big Cubs fan. I'll get into that in just a minute, but there are two baseball teams in Chicago, kind of.
That's true. I was born and raised on the north side. Interestingly, the hospital I was born in has kind of a disturbing name. It's called Ravenswood.
Oh, wow.
I mean, that sounds like the title of a horror fiction series. And
it does.
Of course, in her Red Wing sagas, made Ravens a very important part of that. And ironically, since we've moved here to the Ozarks now, the Crows, for some reason, seem to take a liking to our property.
Huh.
We always see like 4 to 6 of them at any given time, usually out there by about 6 a.m, having morning coffee right outside her windows, it sounds like. And so, she's named a couple of the characters in the Red Wing saga. So, okay, good morning, Urians. Hope you and the gang are having a good time today. But yeah, I was born at Ravenswood Hospital, which is like a long Ernie Banks home run from Wrigley Field, a little further north on Damon Avenue.
Wow. Right there. So I started following the Cubs, and I'm not from the Chicagoland area, but we were from Lynchburg, Virginia, actually. And people always say, how are you a Cubs fan? And I say, because Virginia doesn't have any baseball teams, and you could watch the Cubs on WGN. So the Cubs have a national following because they were nationally syndicated there on WGN. But I came up in the era that was after that with Ryan Sandberg and Sean Dunston and Mark Grace. And we had Rick Sutcliffe tossing and Greg Maddux behind him. And, it was just, of course, Andre Dawson, the Hawk. So I grew up watching all of those guys and have had the opportunity to get up there to Chicago in my adult life and go to Wrigley and watch a few games up there and an experience like none other. I have to admit that I made it up there. I think it was my late 20s I was in by the time I finally got there. And my earliest childhood memories are watching the Cubs on TV in the living room and going out back in the backyard and pretending that I was Ryan Sandberg. The first time.
The authentic jersey that I got for a Christmas gift from our daughter a few years ago is an official MLB Ryan Sandberg jersey. So
he was nobody like him. He's so great. I was a little upset when they passed on him when they were looking for a new manager. It ended up being Joe Madden, which of course was an incredible choice. My heart, I was thinking, bring Rhino in. But so that's a connection there. And I still am a sucker for, and this is what you were teasing me about in the fantasy league, that I still pick all the Cubs. I just can't help it. I'm like, no, they're going to have a great season. Of course, there's nobody to pick anymore, but I actually, as I was just sitting here and getting on, I got a notification from ESPN that the Cubs are signing Cody Bellinger.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yep. It just popped up on a 1-year deal, $17.5 million guaranteed. Yeah, how about that?
That is something. It's funny because, and we should let the audience know that the Fantasy Baseball League that we're part of is the Naked Bible Fantasy Baseball League.
Yes, it is.
Dr. Michael Heiser's the commissioner of the league. So
yeah.
It is one of the team names are hilarious because most of them anyway, have some theological connection to them. Mine don't. I just, Ozark Ramblers. Okay, that'll work. Because we had a Rambler when I was a kid, and we live in the Ozarks now. So that's the connection.
Oh, okay. Very nice. I had wondered.
I know that there's another reference. The Ozark Ramblers is another. There's an old bluegrass group by that name. Anyway, I picked Cody Bellinger his rookie year, in the league because I'd read that, this guy's can't miss. And he went like 6 weeks and didn't hit a lick. And it's like, okay, you're killing me. You're killing me. So I cut him. And of course, he was picked up by one of the other teams. And then he just went crazy and rookie of the year. And so, shows my skill at selecting. Although I am proud to say I've won the league once. So.
Yeah, you had a pretty good showing this season too. It was, I think, were you third place? I'm pulling it up right now.
Yeah, third place.
That's not bad. See, I got in because Dr. Heiser put an open invite out, and I just responded to it, and I said, yeah, I would love to. So he says, come on in. And the first season that I was in, I was actually writing my dissertation, so I didn't pay very close attention. I tried. I think I finished in 11th out of 12, 11th out of 12.
Been there.
Yep. And then the second season, I bumped up to 10th, and I don't know what my excuse was that second season, but this third season, I just had a child, my first child, and I'm pastoring a church now, but I finished in 9th place. So I am steadily moving up
slowly
in the rankings. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
and my team name is Heaven's Gates. So that's the pun there, of course, on my last name. But yeah, a lot of fun. It's fun to be in there, and I'm gonna do better this next coming season. And I can pick a Cub now, and you won't jeer me for it if I get Cody Bellinger. So
and I do tend to default if I've got a choice between a couple of 3 different players, and I had kind of a soft spot for Cubs and former Cubs. Would love to have Kyle Schwarber again. Just because 2016,
Yeah.
But, it is a good way to relax. And just a reminder that there are some things in this world that are worth the effort to defend. And I know that in a broader sense, not just baseball, but basketball, football, our culture at large, sports athletes are entertainers, and they are often treated with a lot more respect and deference than they deserve for their opinions on various social topics. I'm trying to be, gentle here because, I'm old enough now. I mean, it began to dawn on me 20 years ago when I was the age that baseball players were being written off as veterans who needed to retire. So now I'm seeing guys who are the sons of guys who played when I was younger, and grandsons of guys that I remembered from the 60s who are, trying to make it in the league. I realize that these kids are just as dumb as I was when I was that age. And so I'm not going to pay a whole lot of attention to their political views. I tune to baseball and I play fantasy baseball as an escape from all of the other stuff.
Yeah.
When I'm watching basketball or football, and I don't do it as faithfully as I did when I was younger, when I really, really cared what the Bears were doing on any given Sunday, when I really, I made a point to be there in front of that television when I was a kid, especially 1969 and 70, when the Cubs really had a shot. I don't pay that much attention to it anymore because it's a distraction.
Yeah.
And, it's a distraction that helps me relax. I go to bed at night. I'll look at, okay, who's on the waiver wire in the fantasy league? Is like, okay, this guy's not doing great for me, but all right, we'll make a couple of trades and move on to something else. It's a way to relax. But just as with Hollywood, they do have an impact on younger kids because, as when I was like 7, 8 years old, if I had the chance to meet Ron Santo or Ernie Banks or Billy Williams or Fergie Jenkins, I would have been in awe.
Yeah.
Now I realize, hey, they're just as confused about most things as I was at that age. I mean, the current crop of athletes, as evidenced by some of their stances on social issues. For example, LeBron James defending China's human rights record. I mean, come on, dude.
Yeah.
Then I have to step back and remember, okay, he's half the age I was when I was his age. I was still trying to defend Bill Clinton to my dad. So,
yeah.
It's a right-wing conspiracy, Dad.
Yeah.
Anything? Oh, okay. Now I'm his age, and Dad is with the Lord, and he's looking down and kind of laughing. So
yeah. Okay. It reminds me of the old saying. What is it? If you weren't a liberal in your 20s, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a conservative in your 40s or something, you don't have a brain. Something like that.
My dad used to say that too. So
yeah. But you're kind of coming into some I guess, some current events, some social issues and things like that. And we might actually have some of our listenership who doesn't actually know who you are. They might just think we're buddies in a fantasy baseball league right now. So tell everybody real quickly, just most of our listeners probably know who you are, but just tell us a little bit what you do, what you're about, and kind of your work in ministry.
Well, this all started back in well, in a broader sense, it started in my childhood when all my normal 10-year-old friends, when we were, fourth, fifth grade, whatever, were listening to the big top 40 radio disc jockeys in Chicago, like John Records Landecker and Larry Lujak and Captain Whammo, who I found out, by the way, is now an outspoken Christian. So good for Captain Whammo. I was listening to the late night radio talk show hosts like Dr. Milton Rosenberg and Chicago Eddie Schwartz and Dave Baum on the big Chicago AM stations, because that's what I thought was interesting. I didn't care about what was passing for, popular music in the 70s. And I was really interested in hearing these guys interviewing people, talking about stuff and learning stuff. So I'd have my little, when I wasn't listening to Cubs playing, the Dodgers or the Giants out on the West Coast. But it was that got me into radio when I was in college. That kind of took me on a detour because I went into top 40 radio. Because when you're 19, nobody needs a 19-year-old talk show host because you're stupid and you don't know anything.
Yeah.
So anyway, that became my career though, because I enjoyed that. The ability to, I guess, craft with words, and but the enemy tried to distract me, because there are distractions. There are young ladies out there who are impressed with guys who can speak into a microphone, and that was a distraction. I was on a different path then. Fast forward to meeting Sharon, 1997, 98. We got married. Around 2002, we began writing. I stumbled across something on the internet called National Novel Writing Month, which is every year in November a challenge to write 50,000 words. To get people writing again. Everybody thinks they've got a novel in them, but hardly anybody ever sits down in front of a word processor and begins the process of writing. And this is a way to try to kickstart things. So
you called it a word processor.
Yeah. Well, back in 2002,
Yeah, sure.
You go back a little further than that, writing on a Commodore 64,
Yeah.
But we started writing, and Sharon wrote her first novel, Winds of Evil, or the first one that was published by a publisher back in 2002, because of this challenge. And I started it, and I got a head start on a novel that I eventually completed. It was sort of a sci-fi fantasy mashup called Iron Dragons. The second year we did it, I did complete the challenge, got past the 50,000 word mark, and that became my second novel, The God Conspiracy, which we reissued last year, a new edition, when it became obvious that the subjects I covered back in 2003, when I started writing that novel, suddenly were a lot more relevant, because it dealt with a vaccine that was being imposed on a segment of the population that didn't want it.
Wow.
And, some of the powers and principalities behind that. So, and it was really weird, because there were some things that went into that novel that turned out to be things that other ministers that we later came to know had been talking about. For example, Russ Dizdar, the late Russ Dizdar, deliverance minister, Shattered the Darkness Ministries, wrote a book called The Black Awakening, because of something he was hearing consistently from people who were, demonically possessed. A day coming when, at a certain signal, a number of people who were possessed, and possibly DID, which we used to call multiple personality disorder, now it's dissociative identity disorder, would rise up and create havoc all at once, a black awakening. I essentially wrote that into the plot of The God Conspiracy before I'd ever heard of Russ Dizdar. Now, that's not to say, I was guided or anything like that. It was just seemed like a thing. If you're talking about spiritual warfare, how would they try to frighten us into accepting something we normally would not give credence to? And that was it. Just this massive wave of terror that would suddenly hit all at once, and suddenly they'd start rounding up suspects, and it's blamed on an apocalyptic cult of radical Christians. And oh yes, by the way, we've got this bird flu that's going around, and we all need to get this shot. And Sharon let me borrow one of the plot devices from her novel, The Armageddon Strain, something called the BioStrain chip, that was really like a small microprocessor. Again, it's the kind of thing that comes out of a science fiction movie, but science is now catching up to where Sharon was back in 2002. Something that could be used to trigger a medical emergency in those who don't comply. So anyway, that was the novel. But we started podcasting then in 2005 when the publisher that we'd found said, well, okay, how are you going to market your novels? And we thought, well, you're the publisher. We thought that was why you were, why we're letting you publish in the books. So we started podcasting, PID Radio, which stands for Peering into Darkness. So our first episode was buy our books. Then it's like, okay, what do we do for the second episode? Now, this was in March in 2005, which was like 6 months after the code for publishing podcasts had been invented. Dave Weiner and the former MTV VJ, Adam Curry, who now co-hosts the podcast with John C. Dvorak. I'm forgetting what the title of their podcast. But anyway, very influential and very early in the podcasting game. But PID Radio was out there in March of 2005 when Apple was like begging people, submit podcasts to us. We need podcasts for the iTunes store. That's when they still called it the iTunes store. So that led us to start interviewing people and talking about issues that inspired us in what we were writing. And that's how we came to know people like Tom Horn, L.A. Marzulli, Steve Quayle, Guy Malone, David Flynn, the late David Flynn, and many others who were researching and writing in this area. And that led to being interviewed or being asked to come to some of the earliest Prophecy Watchers conferences. The Future Congress in 2011. Tom Horn helped co-produce that. 2012, the Future Congress. And then they just, come out and interview our speakers. And, that's a great idea. So we got all these interviews with all of these prophecy experts that are available at my podcast website, vftb.net. Then they got the bright idea to stick a camera in the room. So they were able to record those and add those as like DVD extras. And then, 2014, they said, well, why don't you speak at the conference? Oh, great. Okay. So we started speaking at conferences, and that led to just a feeling that we were supposed to be doing something else. Meanwhile, I was working as a steel salesman. And I'd been in broadcast coming through college. I got involved in radio, worked in radio until about 92, got out after, I'd been fired often enough. They say you haven't made it in radio until you've been fired 3 times. So I made it +1. And it was, never. Yeah, well, it was never for doing a bad job or being irresponsible. It was always because that's just that business. The boss has a friend who's out of business, out of work, and needs a job. So, okay, you're fired. You're not funny enough. You're fired. We're changing format. Okay, you're fired. That's just how that business works. And at the time, the last time I got fired, our daughter was 8 months old, and decided, okay, let's try to find something else to do. So I got into real estate for a while, then got into steel sales, and did pretty well at that. I mean, my 2 marketable skills, using a computer and talking. So that was right up my alley.
There you go.
So I did that for a number of years. But by about 2014, I was beginning to feel like I needed to be doing something else. And after the Prophecy Watchers Conference in 2015 in Colorado Springs, it was really, by this point, I'd been doing outside sales covering Southern Illinois for like 4 years, learning why the people south of Interstate 80 would like Chicago to go, fall into Lake Michigan. And started talking to people on the advice of Sharon, who saw how frustrated I was. Other brothers who'd been in ministry for a while, just looking for counsel. So, talked to Bob Ulrich at Prophecy Watchers, talked to Tom Horn, and didn't know that they had been talking to each other about launching Skywatch TV. So they invited us out there in the fall of 2015 to ask Sharon, who'd just written a book for Defender Publishing, Ebola and the Fourth Horseman of the Apocalypse, to have her be one of the pilot episodes for the new program, Skywatch TV. And while we were there, Tom asked, would you like to come out here and partner with us and do these daily news commentaries for us? Well, yeah, it was very, very tempting. And then when Joe Horn kind of let the cat out of the bag that Skywatch TV's mission was to provide the funding for Whispering Ponies Ranch, which is the camp that they have set up and make available to partner ministries, Royal Family Kids, who work exclusively with children in the foster care system between the ages of 9 and 11, and Teen Reach, and to do it so that they wouldn't have to pay a dime, so that Royal Family Kids wouldn't have to come up on a camping season to decide which children have to stay at home because we don't have enough money to pay the camp for all of these children. When Joe told us that was the vision for Skywatch TV, we were like, yeah, we're here. We are so here. So we moved out here in February of 2015 and started doing these daily news commentaries 5 days a week. It's not really a news cast because, I do I do the writing, the recording. Until recently, I was my own cameraman. Now we work from home, so Sharon gets that job. But been doing that since April of 2015, commenting on the news 5 days a week. So in all of that, our podcast that we began back in 2005, PID Radio, kind of went by the wayside because we just got busy with the move and being here, and it was just not something we could keep up. But we've just brought it back within the last couple of weeks of this recording, because for 7 years now, we've been producing a weekly television show called Sci Friday. About 2 years ago, going on 3 now, we've launched a program called Unraveling Revelation, where we a weekly 30-minute program there. And it's just that producing video, especially if you're going to add any visual interest, that it takes a lot longer to produce a 30-minute video program than to produce a 1-hour audio program. So we're going to put Sci Friday on the shelf, 300 episodes. We're going to focus on PID Radio. We've got a weekly Bible study that we do called the Gilbert House Fellowship, which is essentially a Bible study podcast that we've been doing since 2014. And we will continue my weekly interview podcast, A View from the Bunker. So we figured out just the other day, we got something like 1,600 episodes, podcast episodes, just audio episodes.
Wow.
Of PID Radio, A View from the Bunker, and our weekly Bible study. And then you add another 300 episodes of Sci Friday, and I think we're at episode 169 of Unraveling Revelation. We've got, people could drive themselves into a padded room if they wanted to binge all of the content that we put out there since 2005. But the Lord opened these doors, and life has led through a series of events that were really training for this. And you're at a certain point in your life, I think everybody reaches a point, you look back and say, oh, that's why that happened. It seemed awful at the time, but now I know why I had to go through that. And that's kind of where we've been led. And that's what we do, looking at the news every day and then trying to apply it to our understanding of Scripture. Yeah.
Yeah. It's funny that you said that about seeing it all kind of come together. I just kind of had a moment like that here recently. I actually kind of walk in that regularly as I'm now a father, and as I'm now the pastor of a church, a college professor, and several other things. And it's kind of like I'm coming into that season of life now where it's all just kind of finally starting to settle into place, and you're looking back like, oh, I understand. I understand what all that was for. But that's really, really exciting. You're a really busy guy, prolific podcaster, a prolific author. I'm looking through your online store right now. I was familiar with some of your works, but wow, you guys must just never stop writing. I'm still trying to revise my dissertation to get it published. I got done with it and just kind of was like, I'm done. But I need to find some, I need to find some publication, get settled back in here.
It helps when you don't have a small child around.
Yes, yes. Well, I'm on daddy duty most days, and he makes it incredibly difficult to get things done. If he's not needing something, I just can't leave him alone. He's just like the greatest toy I've ever had in my life. I love him so much. So it is a little bit difficult, but I'm figuring it all out here. We're settling into a new season, and productivity's coming back. But thank you for filling everybody in there who might not have known, and a nice synopsis of your kind of life story there. But I was wondering if you would care to talk to us, because we have not yet, we on this show talk about kind of the intersection of society and scripture that often leads to some kind of scandal or a stumbling block, if you will. But we have not actually specifically broached the topic of eschatology. It's come up kind of tangentially a couple times, but we have not actually directly talked about eschatology. And since you have a show called Unraveling Revelation, and this show is called Ravel, I thought, why not have a little cross the streams, as you said beforehand, and kind of explore some eschatology. And I could probably guess at your particular blend of eschatology, and I, being a biblical studies major, there's all various ways to approach the book of Revelation, and all different views of whether these things have already come to pass, if we're waiting for them to come to pass, what exactly is going on. But why don't you just I'll just open up the big, broad category of eschatology of the book of Revelation, and take us on a little journey.
Well, Sharon has been studying eschatology since she was young, because she grew up in a church, an independent Baptist church, where it was preached from the pulpit. I grew up in more mainline denominations, where Revelation was not ever discussed. What little exposure I'd had to the book of Revelation came from my dad's curiosity. He brought home a copy of Hal Lindsey's late great Planet Earth, and this was when I was still in high school, and I thought, oh, okay, well, that's kind of interesting, but didn't know why I should believe it. It really didn't have any context or framework to put it into, because the churches we'd been attending since I was a kid, and in high school, where I paid the most attention, I didn't really, when you're young, was evangelical Lutheran, and this was before the ELCA really went liberal. But it just wasn't something that was taught. So I didn't really know what to make of it. I tried to get caught up to where Sharon was over the course of our marriage, but it wasn't really until she said, I really feel led like we need to do this program and do this study with a basis of looking at the book of Revelation and trying to understand it, as Dr. Heiser says we need to do, with a worldview that's as close to that of the apostles as we can come up with, given that we're living 2,000 years later in a completely different culture, and surrounded by all kinds of toys and distractions that they didn't have in the first century AD. So we decided to go ahead and do that, and that has really led to a real deepening of my understanding of Revelation. Now, I'm not a Bible scholar, and I don't pretend to be, but I do have pretty good reading comprehension, and the Lord has blessed me with the ability to see some things and make some connections. So over the past couple of years, I have kind of firmed up my belief that in a pre-tribulation rapture, but with the understanding that a lot of those conclusions are based on suppositions, based on premises that may prove to be untrue or inaccurate. So I can see the arguments for a pre-wrath rapture. I can also see for a mid-tribulation rapture. Post-trib, I don't see it, but I'm happy for the Lord to explain it to me on the way up if I'm wrong.
Sure.
I think there are too many of us who get into these arguments over end times prophecy, and when you actually see people who hold different views accusing the others of not really being saved, it's like, wait, whoa.
Mm-hmm.
We've got enemies outside the camp. Let's not turn the guns on one another here. So premillennial, pre-trib, and I'm happy to give my reasons for it. But if somebody wants to fight about it, it's like, okay, I'll just walk away, because I just don't think it's worth fighting over.
Yeah. Yeah. And just if there's anyone out there listening who doesn't know what premillennial and pre-trib mean, that's essentially just the view of the millennium. So the 1,000-year millennial reign that it talks about at the end of Revelation there, and whether that's going to literally take place, whether it was figurative, or then if it exists at all. You have amillennials, postmillennials, and premillennials, and the premillennial dispensational sort of view is the one that has been predominant in the Western church here in America for at least the last 100 years or so. It
really started to fade around World War I, because amillennialism, this idea that things are just going to kind of get better and better until Jesus returns, kind of took a hit during 20 people killed in the war, another 20 to 50 million dead of the Spanish flu or the Great Influenza. Kind of hard to make that amillennial case.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that being more kind of like a post-mill sort of thing, but the amil, it's whether or not essentially Revelation was that the prophecies therein were fulfilled in the first century, particularly with the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, or whether we are still waiting to see these things come to pass that John was writing about. And I am in a unique camp where I think I listen to those who take an mill, kind of post-mill, that preterist sort of view, where they believe that all this stuff John was writing about things that already took place. And we know that some of Revelation, John is writing about things that already had transpired. He writes about Jesus' birth, for instance, and various other sorts of things from the past. So very likely, that, and I don't know, where you would date Revelation either, but most people believe that he wrote it after 70 AD. So after these things had already taken place. So he wasn't writing about things that were going to happen in a certain sense. He was writing about a cataclysm that already befell the nation of Israel, that already befell the church, the Christian church there at the time, and something that I believe was going to continue to endure. And you find these recapitulations over and over and over again throughout time, all kind of leading up to this one final day, the day of the Lord, this final moment where we will see all of these things, where we will actually see another literal Antichrist. And I say another one because when you read in, 1 John, there's many Antichrists, right? I mean, there have been many, and we'll see another one yet to come. So that just kind of just a quick flyby there of the different takes on it. But a lot of people I don't think that a lot of people even know that there are various views. I think most people just think really the only controversy is whether or not the rapture is going to happen before or in the middle of or after the tribulation. But I am curious to hear you make a defense for. You said you're pretty convinced about a pre-tribulation rapture. What is it that has led you to land there?
Again, it's based on a premise which, if proven to be untrue, kind of the whole superstructure falls apart. And this is the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel.
Sure.
He's told to expect 70 weeks that have been set aside for your people, the angel tells him. And the assumption is that those weeks of years, that each week is a period of 7 years, 70 weeks have been set aside for your people and the holy city. And I don't have the scripture in front of me, but that's the paraphrase. And that at the end of the 69th week, an anointed one would be cut off. And Sir Robert Anderson, around 1915, oddly enough, he was one of the investigators of the Jack the Ripper killings back in 1888. He wrote a book called The Coming Prince, and he pointed out that if you used a 360-day prophetic year, which, the Hebrew calendar was a 360-day year, 12 30-day months, and you begin with the decree of Artaxerxes around 440 BC, and not from the destruction of the temple in 586, by Nebuchadnezzar, you actually wound up with the arrival of Jesus on the back of the donkey's colt, the triumphal entry, to the day in Anderson's view. And Chuck Missler had pointed that out in some of his teachings, and I just thought, wow, okay. But if you take that 69 weeks, the 70 weeks as being for your people, and assume, and again, this is the assumption, that the angel was talking about your people, the Jews, and we are waiting for that 70th week to begin, which is how this 70-week prophecy is interpreted, that that final 7-year period that's referred to as the Great Tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble. If that applies to the Jews, then the assumption is that during that 7-year period, the church, those who have accepted Jesus Christ, would not be here. So that's essentially it in a nutshell, where I come down on the pre-trib rapture. But again, like I said, somebody wants to make a case for pre-wrath. Yeah, I've interviewed pre-wrath teachers a number of times on my podcast, and have no problem with it. It's like, okay, well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And Mitch, I can see the case for that as well. There are verses you can point to in Scripture that seem to suggest that at the midpoint of that 7-year period, but I think a lot of these arguments come down to semantics too. What do we mean by tribulation versus great tribulation? And I'm just not willing to argue that. I mean, when we do our program on, which is carried coast to coast on the PTL network, we will say, look, this is what we think, this is what we believe, but we're open to people who have differing views, because God made this deliberately obtuse. I mean, the apostles were still arguing, or we're still asking Jesus in Acts chapter 1, because he's not yet been caught up into heaven yet, in the first chapter of Acts, will you restore the kingdom to Israel now? Yeah. They're still looking for, and they'd been learning from Jesus for 3.5 years. They were there when he delivered the Olivet Discourse, and, told him all of these things, tear this temple down, and 3 days later we'll raise it up again. They didn't get it. So I'm pretty sure that we don't understand the prophecies of Jesus' second coming any better than the apostles did. Yeah. So, and that's because the enemy, the spirit realm, those who've rebelled against God, they are even better scholars of prophecy than we are. In fact, Sharon has said, I wonder if the demons in the fallen realm actually have their own prophecy conferences, where they get together with their charts and graphs and PowerPoints and try to figure out, okay, do you think the Messiah is coming now? Because we got to have all of our plans in place for the Gog-Magog conflict before that happens. Who knows? Maybe they do. It's not really a joke, because these entities that have rebelled against God are very old, much more intelligent and powerful than we are in our natural form. And they really, really want to destroy everything that we love. Yeah. So, we are a little bit odd in that, even though we are premillennial and pre-trib, we completely agree that a lot of what John wrote in Revelation was looking back. And one of the things we think that he wrote in looking backward at an event that took place in the past was the opening of the first 5 seals in Revelation chapter 6. We think the riders, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, are already out and riding, and have been since Jesus was caught up into heaven in the year 32 or 33 AD. Yeah. That's interesting. I have heard takes on that before. I don't know that I've specifically heard you guys talk about it, but I have come in contact with that perspective before. But I just want to say, before we move on too much further, that I very much appreciate your openness and willingness to be wrong, and to say that you have these convictions about interpretations of some of these things, but that you hold them loosely. It's one of the things that we talk about here on this show. We kind of, if you've ever heard Al Mohler talk about theological triage, where you essentially find these 3 different compartments for your theology, and they're in dogmas, doctrines, and beliefs. And your dogmas are those things that you are unshakably convinced about, usually having to do with the person and work of Jesus Christ and the authority of Scripture, those sorts of things that we are dogmatic about. And then after that, you have your doctrines, and those are
things that you feel strongly about, that you feel are very important, but you're still willing to have your mind changed. And as far as I'm concerned, and just to finish it off, beliefs are those things that kind of are inconsequential, but you have opinions about them. But as far as I'm concerned, eschatology is one of those areas that should fall right there in the middle in doctrine. And it is one of those things that really can tend to divide the church. And I listen to, and I have been consumed with in certain seasons of my life, end times biblical prophecy and looking for signs and these different things that were going on. And there are some teachers out there who become very dogmatic about the rapture and whether or not it will happen. Usually it is the ones who are convinced that it will happen and it will be before the tribulation. And I appreciate that you are will give a disclaimer and yes, argue for, the points that you believe, but always, I think in these areas, especially those of us with platforms, those of us with credentials and things, we need to be careful about what we're telling people, because if we don't know it for certain, we shouldn't be telling people for certain, because what I'm finding in being a professor and a pastor, and you might find this too, being an influencer through as an author and a podcaster, is that people start to listen to you, and then they make decisions in their lives, important decisions in their lives based on the things that you're saying. So very much appreciate that you take the position that you do there, and it's one that I believe I'm with you on it, and I kind of lean myself towards a pre-tribulation rapture. I do lean there. That's kind of where I'm at for some of the reasons that you just explained. But one of the things too that I also tell people, particularly in my church, is that kind of like you had talked about, there's tribulation and then there's the great tribulation. We shouldn't expect, and especially here in our cozy, for now, Western American churches, that if a pre-tribulation rapture doctrine is indeed true, that means that we're going to escape from this earth without any kind of real persecution or trouble.
Oh, no. I mean, that's not biblical. Jesus told his followers that they would endure tribulation. And I think it's a very Amerocentric view. If we look at the church in China, look at the church in places in the Middle East, in Africa, Nigerian Christians, Sudanese Christians. I mean, they've been tribulated for a long, long time.
Yes.
And even if you look just at the history of Islam, for example, and I know this is not a politically correct thing to say, but you look at the 1400-year history of relations between Islam and the West, we need to understand the reason the West is called the West is because that was all that was left if the armies of Islam conquered pretty much all of Christendom in the 7th and 8th centuries. That's all that was left. And if it hadn't been for Charles Martel at the Battle of Tours in 732 AD, there wouldn't have been a West either.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, you said it exactly as I say, almost exactly. But yes, there are our brothers and sisters, our Christian brothers and sisters all over the world right now are experiencing all of those terrors and all of the horrors that we look to that will be in the Great Tribulation, those persecutions, being hunted down, having your life taken from you because of your faith. That's happening, yes, all across the world. And to think that the United States of America is somehow the centerpiece of end times Bible prophecy, when obviously that is the nation of Israel. But we do believe that as it goes here in America, so it goes for the rest of the world, right?
Yeah, it's again, it's a very Amerocentric view, and we do need to remember that Israel plays a key role in end times prophecy. And there are those who will go in a completely different direction and just say, well, Israel today is not the real Israel. And so we can't look at what happens. That I understand that the geopolitical entity called Israel is every bit as flawed and human as the geopolitical entity we call the United States of America. I get that. But you can't get around the prophecies that there are certain roles to be filled in the end times, and Israel plays a role. And unless you can show me where the prophecies or that the preterists or even the partial preterists, people who believe that some of the prophecies in the book of Revelation were fulfilled prior to 70 AD with the destruction of Israel, or the destruction of Jerusalem rather, and the temple. Boy, I mean, there's just so many things that are in Revelation that say, this thing that's going to happen is unlike anything that has come before it. Nothing like this has ever been seen before or since. You really have to allegorize a lot of those things to interpret this as a chronicle of past events. And then when you say, okay, all right, I accept the futurist interpretation of Revelation. Well, okay. And then since John was clearly drawing on Daniel and Ezekiel and Zechariah and other apocalyptic prophecies from the Old Testament, then you've got to consider that, okay, maybe the Jews really do have something to do with what's going to happen in the last days. And maybe we Americans need to get over ourselves. Maybe there's a reason, and we can only speculate because we don't know, but maybe there's a reason that America is not in end times prophecy. Or, maybe it's there and we just haven't figured out yet. I had a very interesting interview with Jackie Alnor recently about her interpretation. She believes that America is there in end times prophecy.
Mystery Babylon?
No, it's because that's been done. She and our good friend Doug Woodward and his co-authors Dean McGriff and I'm going to forget his other colleague Doug Krieger wrote a book on America as Mystery Babylon. But no, Jackie thinks that the reunification of Ephraim and Judah, that essentially the United States is Ephraim, and it's more complicated than I can spin out here in just a few minutes to do it justice. But she's very clear that this is not a what do they call it? British Israelism or anything like that. This is not a belief that the Anglo-Saxons are the true Jews or anything like that.
Not the lost tribe.
Not the lost. Yeah, essentially it is the regathering, because look, there are a lot of Jews who live in the United States right now.
Sure.
I think it's just within the last 2 years that Israel finally, the balance kind of tipped, and there are now more Jews in Israel than there are in the rest of the world. But until recently, that was not the case.
Some people would say so many they're even running the affairs here in the United States.
Yeah, I know. And I don't even want to get into that stuff, because that way lies some really, really ugly justifications for some really bad doctrine. But at the end of the day, our friend John Haller, who is a teaching pastor at a church just outside Columbus, Ohio, said, if you tell me what you believe about eschatology, I can pretty much guess what the rest of your theology is like. Because if you believe that these things are yet to be fulfilled and that Jesus is literally coming back to set up his kingdom here on earth and will judge, the quick and the dead, to borrow a phrase, you kind of set your focus as a Christian on witnessing, because we know that there is a judge who is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and he is ultimately just and fair. And frankly, what most of us deserve, according to the Bible, is death. The wages of sin is death. There is none righteous, no, not one. And so if we're looking to that, and for him to come back and establish his kingdom here, we're going to focus on that. We're fighting a holding action here. Our mission is not to take over the world, because he does that at the head of a heavenly army.
Yeah.
And we get too caught up in the political game and trying to establish heaven on earth through our own actions. We're losing sight of the real long game that God has been playing, and that these supernatural rebels, the fallen angels and their demonic minions, have been trying to thwart for thousands upon thousands of years. So that's what John meant. And I agree with him. If we think that we're living in an amillennial or post-millennial realm, which, again, I can't get my head around that. Really? I mean, does it look like Satan is bound?
Yeah. Yeah.
We think that we are supposed to set up heaven here on earth. We are supposed to establish God's kingdom on earth. And sadly, there are some Christians who really believe that. The dominionists who take it to an extreme and believe, by misapplying Psalm 110 verse 1, that we need to make God's enemies a footstool beneath his feet before he can return.
Yeah.
No, that is wrong. And again, it all comes back to, what do you believe about end times prophecy? Your beliefs about eschatology kind of shape your theology. And I think if you're not a futurist, it really is shaping your theology in the wrong, it's guiding it in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
It's can anyway.
There's a lot that I want to cover, so I'm trying to gauge our time appropriately here, but you kind of offered an interesting segue there when you had talked about the fact that the fallen angels, that the minions of Satan essentially have been trying to thwart the plan of God, and I wanted to talk some about that. You have your most recent book, The Second Coming of Saturn. Mm-hmm. Do you want to talk about that some? What's the thesis there, the premise there? What's that one about?
That was really an outgrowth of research Sharon and I have been doing the last few years into the Nephilim and the Rephaim, essentially different names for the same entities. Nephilim, the giants created by the sons of God, Genesis chapter 6. They saw that the daughters of man were fair and took wives of any they chose. And that led to some pretty serious consequences. God sent a flood to destroy the all flesh on earth except for Noah and his family. And we don't get much description in Genesis chapter 6. It's not explicit in the book of Genesis that's why God sent the flood. That's expanded in the extra biblical book of First Enoch. Mm-hmm. But there's a character in First Enoch, the leader of this rebellious group of sons of God, B'nai Elohim, called Shemiyaza. And he is cast into the underworld by the archangel Michael, according to First Enoch. And given that this was written in the 3rd century BC, okay, this is not, an ancient text. This is not, despite the name, written by the patriarch Enoch in the pre-flood era and somehow miraculously preserved through the flood and all that. But it does give us a window into what Jewish religious scholars and teachers believed in the centuries leading up to the birth of Jesus. And it's mentioned and, in fact, explicitly quoted by Jude in his epistle. So it's important for understanding what was in the minds of the apostles as they were going forth to spread the gospel. And the early church, in fact, clearly references it. There was some argument among the early church fathers as to whether or not it should be in the canon. Shemiyaza always struck me as an interesting character because he was a leader of this group that was punished by being sent to the netherworld. Peter and Jude both explicitly mention the angels who sinned were in chains in gloomy darkness. And Peter is even more explicit. He says God thrust them down to Tartarus. Our English Bibles say hell, but 2 Peter 2, verse 4, the Greek word there is tartarosis, thrust down to Tartarus, which was a separate level of the underworld devoted to supernatural rebels, at least in the Greek mind. But Peter used that word specifically, only place in the New Testament it's used. And so who is this guy? Who is this entity, Shemiyaza? Well, you don't really have to do a lot of study to see the parallels between the story of those entities called watchers in the book of First Enoch, sons of God in Genesis chapter 6, and the career of the old gods of the Titans or the Romans and the Greeks, the Titans, led by Kronos to the Greeks, Saturn to the Romans, hence the name of the book, Second Coming of Saturn. But what scholars have learned over the last 80 years is that this also parallels older stories from Anatolia, modern Turkey, where their creator god, the one who occupied the same slot in the pantheon as Kronos and Saturn, was called Kumarbi. And like Kronos and Saturn, he was overthrown by his son, the storm god, and banished to the netherworld. And when you go back even further, you see, well, there's really, in broad strokes, it's the same story from ancient Mesopotamia, where the father god Enlil winds up by the time of Abraham as a judge in the netherworld, replaced by Marduk, who was not a storm god specifically, but he had storm god attributes. He controlled the winds and lightning and stuff like that. So it's the same story over and over again. We even see it in some of the Baltic peoples and some of the Slavic peoples, where their storm god Perun takes over. In the Hindu culture, Indra, in their ancient religion, the storm god wound up as the king of the pantheon. Same story over and over again. Mm-hmm. And we know what, the storm god to the Canaanites was Baal, same as Zeus, same as Jupiter. Baal was identified, or at least linked to Satan, by Jesus in Matthew chapter 12, where he's confronted by the Pharisees saying, you're casting out demons by the power of Beelzebul, Baal the prince. And Jesus says, if Satan casts out demons by his own power, how will his kingdom stand? Oh, okay. Baal equals Satan. All right. Well, that good working hypothesis there. But what happened to the other guy? What happened to the guy who was banished, who led the rebellion and got him and his colleagues banished to the netherworld, like the Titans of the Greeks? So I started digging into this entity, and you find that across the ancient Near East, Anatolia, Greece, and Rome, there was an entity who filled that same slot in the pantheon of all these different people. Saturn to the Romans, Kronos to the Greeks, Baal Hammon to the Phoenicians, the god who demanded child sacrifice, the Tophet at Carthage with 2,000 infant children, their bones burned and charred as an offering. El of the Canaanites, Enlil of the Akkadians and Babylonians, Dagon of the Philistines, Ashur of the Assyrians, Kumarbi of the Hurrians and Hittites, over and over again, the same entity, and it always winds up connected to the netherworld. And I found some brilliant research by a scholar who identified this same entity as Milcom of the Ammonites. Well, Milcom is a title in their language. It means king, like Melech in Hebrew. But when you look at the list of names from what few Ammonite inscriptions have been found, you would expect, since he's the chief god of their pantheon, their creator god, that you would find that name, Milcom, as the theophoric element or the god name in personal names like Hezekiah or Ezekiel. But you don't. What you find is Ilu, which is the Ammonite form of El. So Milcom is El. But what's interesting is that we find in 1 Kings that Milcom to the Hebrews was Molech. So now we've got a connection between Shemiyaza, the leader of this rebellion who's cast down to the netherworld, clearing the way for the storm god to take over as the chief god of the pagans around ancient Israel, Saturn, Kronos, El, Dagon, Enlil, Molech, replaced by Baal, Jupiter, Zeus, etc., etc. And then when I started doing a little more digging, you find that when Solomon, in his later years, after building the temple of Yahweh on the Temple Mount, across the valley on the Mount of Olives, which is 200 feet higher, and directly to the east, so that when you open the doors of the Temple of Solomon, you see the Mount of Olives across the valley. Solomon built high places there for Astarte, the goddess of, well, sex and violence, really. Chemosh, the war god of the Ammonites, later known as Ares or Mars to the Greeks and Romans, and Molech. He put a high place for Molech on the Mount of Olives that you could see when you open the doors of the temple and look to the east. And this is why, according to 1 Kings, they referred to the Mount of Olives as the Mount of Corruption. But when you read it in the Hebrew, it's Har Ha Mashkith, and Ha is the definite article the. So Mount of the Corruption? No, it actually turns out that Mashkith means destruction or destroyer. It's the Mount of the Destroyer. And coming back to the book of Revelation now, this is where we get into the future implications for all of this, stuff that frankly is interesting to me as a history nerd, but maybe not to a lot of other people. But when you put this together and realize that Jesus spent the last week of his life dividing his time between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount, going into the temple, throwing out the money changers, healing, teaching, preaching, and then on the Mount of Olives, where he'd previously raised Lazarus from the dead, delivering his Olivet Discourse, his longest teaching about end times prophecy and what would happen in the last days, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man, and so forth, there on the Mount of Olives, where he was then betrayed, arrested, crucified, buried, descended into the abyss, according to 1 Peter 3, where he proclaimed to the spirits in prison who formerly did not obey in the days of Noah. In other words, he went down and declared victory over Shemiyaza / Saturn / all these other names. And then at dawn of the third day, he was resurrected, where he was seen by the women coming to the tomb. And according to the Gospel of Luke, that was where he was caught up in heaven from Bethany on the Mount of Olives. And according to Zechariah 14, it's where he returns and splits the Mount of Olives in half. So I think it was because Solomon had placed this temple to Molech on the high place there, prompting the priests to refer to it as the Mount of the Destroyer. I think That's the connection to Revelation chapter 9 and Abaddon and Apollyon, the destroyer. And that is why I think Jesus spent so much time in the last week of his life and will come back when he returns to put a stop to all this foolishness right there on the Mount of Olives. You're going to put a temple here on this high place looking down on my temple? We'll see about that. So that in a nutshell is where the book goes. Well, it's a pretty big nut, I guess. But that is a summary of the book and why I found this character so interesting. I mean, he was blamed for this rebellion in Genesis 6 that has had these long-running implications. Sharon and I dealt with the cult of the Nephilim in our book Veneration, the cult of the dead. But it's like, what has happened to this entity? Where is he? What's he doing now? And I think that's what the second coming of Saturn is all about. And as Tom Horn has written in previous books like Apollyon Rising 2012, Zenith 2016, Zeitgeist 2025, there's a lot of really interesting symbolism and artwork inside the United States Capitol. I interpret it just a little differently. Because I think the art and architecture of the United States Capitol points to an expectation that a prophecy or an alleged prophecy by the Roman poet Virgil, called his fourth eclogue, where he prophesies a new golden age, where Saturn returns and rules over a golden age with a new breed of men sent down from heaven. There are occult adepts who have been working to make that prophecy a reality for a very long time. And, I'll just throw out this nugget. I don't think it's a coincidence that 1 month after the Great Conjunction on the winter solstice of 2020, when Jupiter, the king of the pantheon, and Saturn, the former king of the pantheon, met in the night sky, what astrologers call the Great Mutation. They see it as a handing of the baton back from Jupiter to Saturn and the dawning of this new golden age as it marked at 0 degrees of Aquarius, which is where these two planets met in the night sky, the beginning, the final entry, full entry into the age of Aquarius. And then 1 month later, the World Economic Forum rolls out its plan for the Great Reset. I don't think it's a coincidence.
It's interesting, the symbolism that's tied up in the character of Saturn and even the planet. I'm sure you're familiar with the strange hexagon at the pole there. The little, very bizarre. I don't know what your take is on that. How that got there, or why that's there. If that's in the Lord's creation, or if something has manipulated that. If people are not familiar, you can do a Google search for the pole of Saturn, and it's got a strange six-sided figure at the top of it. It also the sixth planet from the sun, and in the pagan worldview, Saturn has to do with enlightenment, the age of enlightenment, and you see all of that, kind of coalescing. And I was not aware of the alignment that happened in the passing of the baton, as you said. So that's at the heart of your of the book. Then it's about the coming into kind of this new age of this new era, I suppose.
The last few chapters deal with that. Tom views the and again, this was a big deal in December of 2020. I mean, it was all over the news. Oh, it's the Christmas star. This is probably what the Magi saw 2,000 years ago. Well, no, it's not. I mean, here in the Ozarks, we've got a pretty dark sky, and I went out and looked at it. These two bright planets very close together. Mm-hmm. Not enough to make me get on a camel and travel for 3 or 4 months from Babylon to Jerusalem to try to find the newborn king. There was something a lot more spectacular than that the Magi were looking at, but that's for another day. This was something that makes is a bigger deal to astrologers and occultists than to Christians. I mean, as a Christian, I understand our fortunes, our futures are not determined by the movement of the planets in the night sky. Mm-hmm. But there are some very powerful and wealthy people who do believe this. I mean, even for conservative Christians, we need to remember back to Ronald Reagan's presidency when Nancy Reagan was setting his calendar based on advice from her personal astrologer. So this should not be surprising to us.
Yeah.
But, this prophecy by the Roman poet Virgil, which was written around the year 40 BC. This was just after the assassination of Julius Caesar and during the early days of the triumvirate, where Octavian, who later became Caesar Augustus, was co-ruling with a guy named Lepidus, who history's pretty much forgotten, and Mark Antony. And Antony, of course, Antony and Cleopatra kind of went down in flames and left Octavian the last man standing. But the Roman poet Virgil, who's best known for his epic poem called the Aeneid, wrote a poem for his one of his patrons. And when you're a poem, you have to get a wealthy sponsor to underwrite your lifestyle. So he wrote this poem for a politician by the name of Pollio, Gaius Asinius Pollio, who'd just been elected. What's the consul, which is the highest elected official in Rome, like the president of Rome, basically. And this prophecy, or it was taken as prophecy, even as far back as the time of Constantine, the emperor who legalized Christianity, because he saw in this poem, this fourth eclogue of Virgil, a prophecy of Jesus. It's like, well, no. I mean, when you get down here, he shall receive the life of gods and see heroes with gods commingling. Heroes was the term used by the Greeks and Romans for the demigods and the spirits of the demigods, like Heracles and Theseus and Perseus, the Nephilim, basically. Mm-hmm. That's not a prophecy of Jesus, but that's how Constantine chose to interpret it. But Virgil was seen as a pagan prophet for, a very long time. In fact, it was there was a practice that was known even up until the 17th century called the Virgilian lots. Basically, you would take a copy of this poem that he wrote, the Aeneid, which is sort of like the aftermath of the fall of Troy, and how Aeneas, and his followers sailed to Italy and became the eventual founders of Rome. You would take a copy of this book, you'd kind of flop it open, stick your finger on a page, read the verses there, and then try to interpret that as a prophecy for you. I mean, sadly, is the way some people read the Bible. Flip it open to a page, stick your finger on it, and see what verse is there for you. That's not how you read the Bible.
Bibliomancy.
Yeah. Well, this is Virgiliomancy, I guess. But yeah, I mean, even as late as the time of King Charles I in the 17th century, before he lost his head to Oliver Cromwell, had looked inside a copy of the Aeneid to see what his future held. It was something to do with losing his head, and of course he did. But when you get into the 1930s, and again, I credit Tom Horn for finding this, and the decision by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his Vice President Henry Wallace to take the Great Seal of the United States and put it on the back of the dollar bill. This was interpreted as a prophecy, and both Wallace and FDR were 32nd degree Scottish Rite Freemasons. They understood that this was a prophecy of the United States eventually assuming leadership among the nations in inaugurating the new order of the ages, Novus Ordo Seclorum. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it was FDR who took the reverse of the Great Seal, which is that unfinished pyramid with the seeing eye, which Wallace had proposed putting on the right side of the dollar bill, the shield with the eagle on the left side, because that's the front side of the seal. Mm-hmm. That's what's used to seal official government documents. The unfinished pyramid has never been used to seal any official United States government document, but FDR switched it, and by putting it on the left, made it appear as though it was the more important of the two. So this was the influence of Freemasonry on the United States. When you couple that with the apotheosis of Washington, the painting that's on the inside of the United States Capitol Dome, I interpret that based on Washington's position, his seated position, and the fact that his legs are wrapped in purple cloth in that painting. Just as, purple representing, of course, in ancient Rome, representing royalty, but the fact that his legs were covered. This is how the statue of Saturn was depicted in the Temple of Saturn in ancient Rome. His legs were wrapped in wool, except during the Saturnalia, and that represented his confinement in the netherworld, except for that 1 week when he came out and social norms were overturned during all the merriment and celebration and so forth. It's not well known that, for one thing, you're looking up at that painting of Washington through the oculus, which was inspired by the Pantheon in Rome. Now, the Pantheon in Rome has a dome. It was devoted to all of the gods, but the oculus in the dome in Rome opened up to the sky, and it represented the portal through which the spirit of Caesar would ascend when he became one of the gods. Well, of course, the painting of Washington on the inside of the Capitol dome shows him ascending and becoming one of the gods, the pantheon of pagan gods of ancient Rome. Below the visitors gallery there, the basement level essentially, or the first floor level of the United States Capitol, they call the crypt. Nobody's buried there, but the plan had been to bury George Washington there, or at least have him lie in state there. There was a chamber that was created, and Martha Washington, in fact, had given her approval to put George in this chamber, and there was basically a hole in the floor of the rotunda so that people visiting the rotunda could look up and see the oculus. Now, at the time of Washington's death, it was still 50 years before that painting was put up there, but Washington would be down below so people could look down, and you'd have another oculus, again, representing a portal through which the spirit of Washington would presumably ascend. Then the War of 1812 came, and the British burned the Capitol, and that kind of put things back a little bit. And by the time they were ready to bring Washington's body from Mount Vernon, Martha had passed, and George's sons and descendants said, no, we're not doing that. But that was the plan. That was the plan. And the depiction of George Washington on the ceiling inside the U.S. Capitol dome should be disturbing enough, just depicting the father of our nation as the father of the gods, Saturn, in my view, who I believe is the destroyer, Apollyon Abaddon, who was in ancient times known as Shemiyaza, the leader of this rebellion, who, and I argue in the book, by the way, that I think the passage in Isaiah 14, in which Halel ben Shakar, the Hebrew, is translated into Latin as Lucifer, so we assume that that's his name, the name of Satan, that is. I don't think that refers to Satan. I think that refers to Shemiyaza. I think that refers to that rebel who is throughout the pagan cultures of in ancient history, the cultures around ancient Israel, connected to the netherworld. There are references, for example, in Isaiah 14, later in Isaiah 14, also Ezekiel 32, where Asher, who is the Assyrian version of Enlil, is connected to the netherworld. And in Ezekiel 32, specifically, the outer reaches of the pit, which I think is a reference to the abyss or Tartarus rather than to Sheol. The trouble with discerning the presence of the Assyrian chief deity Asher in the Old Testament is that same word, Asher, can also refer to the nation Assyria or to a single person, an Assyrian or the Assyrian. In Micah 5, there's a reference to the Assyrian, but the definite article, the, is missing. It's not there. So, yeah. So anyway, I go into all of that in much more detail in the book.
Yeah.
My argument is that this entity, Shemiyaza, in the ancient world, in the time of John, in the time of Jesus, was referred to by the cultures around the Mediterranean as Kronos, Saturn, or Baal-Hamon, or El of the Canaanites, will be the same entity who emerges from the abyss in Revelation 9 as Abaddon or Apollyon. And same entity referred to in Isaiah chapter 14. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, or Halel? I think that's who is being described there. And there's some scholarly evidence for that, by the way. The Hebrew Halel, according to a scholar named William Gallagher, is the West Semitic form of Elil, which was the Akkadian form of Enlil. So we're dealing with not the storm god, we're dealing with the one the storm god replaced in Isaiah 14. Lucifer is not Satan.
I want to just take a moment in case, because in your stuffy academic environments, a lot of times, with some rare exceptions like our friend Dr. Heiser, you get into a lot of this stuff, and people are quite skeptical and think that you've taken a lot of liberties, to arrive at your conclusions. Although I will say your track of evidence there maps out pretty well for me. But here recently, I think that a lot of people who would be critical of any types of interpretations like you've laid out here have been kind of really helped in this the work here of Graham Hancock recently. I'm sure you've been following the Ancient Apocalypse show on Netflix. Mm-hmm. And as you've been talking about all of this with the alignments of the planets and the stars, and how having our figureheads pass on into the next world, and creating burial chambers and things like that for them, you see all of these sorts of things taking place all over the world. And you see this common sort of story being told, and much like you've even been saying with Saturn, and how there have been various different names and various different tellings of this story. When you start to see it over and over and over again throughout human history, there has to be something going on with it. And that has been one of the more compelling pieces of evidence for me as to, the idea of, apart from, the biblical text itself, because, aside from Genesis 6, and then even, a little bit in Numbers, and of course you have, Jude and 2 Peter and those sorts of things. And if you want to include Enoch into the discussion, you can, but the evidence, some would say, is kind of scant there in the biblical text. But when you look around at archaeology throughout the world, you see that human beings across the entire globe and for all of known history have been telling these same sorts of stories of these otherworldly beings coming down, and sometimes cohabitating, commingling, sometimes just sharing information, teaching different types of magic, various religious practices, these sorts of things. And then when you start getting into what some people would consider, crazy sorts of end times interpretations, and, hearing you talk about, George Washington being kind of depicted as some kind of deity, where people would tend to scratch their heads, you just kind of have to stand back and look and say, no, this is something that people have believed for the entire history of humankind. And it's not that far-fetched. And the more that I have been looking at, kind of ancient anthropology, the more that when I listen to folks in, kind of the cadre that you would tend to run in, the more that I'm like, I think these guys are really onto something here. I mean, it's pretty compelling, because when you think about it too, just from a biblical standpoint, I mean, the enemy is using the same sorts of attacks over and over. He doesn't have anything new to use, so it's just kind of a repackaging of the same thing. And you had talked just briefly before about Hollywood and the influence there, and the things that are coming to us in movies and through our music, and even here just recently in the fashion world, as we saw that there is all kinds of crazy, satanic, very dark, spiritual messaging that's being sent through pretty much every single avenue that you could send it. It's all being used, and it seems to all be pointing to something. So I just want to say, for anybody who's out there kind of listening and thinking this guy might be a little off his rocker, maybe not. Maybe you're not, Derek. Maybe you're one of the sane ones.
Well, yeah, it's like we like to say, we're not going crazy, we're going sane in a crazy world. We were surprised as we started researching this several years ago, and this is what resulted in our book, Veneration, which essentially lays out the cult of the Nephilim, and how they have influenced worship around the world for literally thousands of years. There is good scholarly research, and after my first book, where I tried not to overwhelm readers with a lot of footnotes, and was called out for it by a couple of readers that said, "Well, okay, you're assuming that we all know that, for example, the Amorites founded Babylon, but where's the footnote?" Okay, so the last 5 books, nonfiction books, 6 nonfiction books that I've contributed to or written, you're talking between 400 and 500 footnotes in each book. And most of it is coming from secular, peer-reviewed research. These are guys who do not have a dog in the hunt, for many of them anyway, to interpret things the way Sharon and I have interpreted them. And in the book Veneration, we showed that these ideas and the influence of these spirits of the Nephilim, who it was understood, it was taken as a given by the early church for about the first 400 years after the resurrection, that demons were the spirits of the giants who died in the flood of Noah. Mm-hmm. When you read the early church fathers like Irenaeus and Justin Martyr and Athenagoras and Origen and so on and so on, for about the first 400 years, it was, these were the spirits who were created when angels came down and commingled with human women, and they were destroyed in the flood. And they were essentially recapitulating and teaching what came right out of the book of Enoch, specifically the first 36 chapters, what scholars call the book of the Watchers. Well, when you read the Old Testament, you realize, and sadly, I don't read Hebrew. I'm going to have to learn one of these days. But thankfully, with Bible software, you can read side by side and check, do searches for Hebrew words that otherwise I wouldn't be able to read. You find that references to the Rephaim are a lot more common than we've been taught, because usually that word is translated into English by well-meaning scholars who didn't have this understanding that recent archaeological research has provided by giving us context for the Hebrew language from the ancient world, usually translated into English as the dead, the departed, the shades, or something like that. And for example, in Isaiah 26, verse 14, they are dead. That's the Hebrew word metim. They are dead. They will not live. They are shades. No, they are Rephaim. They will not arise. Isaiah is prophesying in Isaiah 26 resurrection, but he's saying the Rephaim will not arise. And there are other references to the Rephaim throughout the Old Testament that we document in the book Veneration. This cult of the dead was central to the worldview of the people around ancient Israel. You had to summon your ancestors by name once a month on the 30th day of the month, the night of no moon. So presumably the veil between worlds was thinnest then. This ritual came from the Amorites. It was called kispum. And you would summon the ancestors by name, and you would feed them and give them drink. This is what those household idols, the teraphim, were used for. This was such an important part of the culture that permeated the ancient Near East, that it continued well into the Christian era. In fact, when Constantine legalized the faith and Christian churches began to be built under his patronage in Rome, the early 4th century AD, those churches, including St. Peter's Basilica, were built in the middle of cemeteries, so that Christians, even though they've been told for 300 years, we don't do this anymore. This is not how the spirit realm works. Your ancestors are not coming back here for you to feed them with a monthly ritual. We don't do the necromancy thing anymore. They wouldn't stop. And so the early churches in Rome, archaeologists have found, were built in the middle of cemeteries so that the early Christians could continue summoning the ancestors and giving them food and drink. And because it was believed that if you weren't fed by your descendants after you died, you ceased to exist in the netherworld. In fact, in 2 Samuel 18:18, David's son, Absalom, it mentions in passing that he erected a pillar for himself in the Valley of the Kings, for he had no son to keep his name in remembrance. If you didn't do this ritual where you summoned your ancestors by name every month, they would cease to exist in the afterlife. Now, what do we do with that? Well, we look around the world today and we see that the Day of the Dead in Mexico is still a big deal, where the spirits of the ancestors come and party with you, apparently. But it's all over the world. The cult of the ancestors continues all over the world. Africa, China, Korea, it's everywhere. And you can trace it back to the cult instilled in the ancient Near East by the Amorites. And we suggest that, it's speculation, but perhaps this is what God meant when he told Abraham the iniquity or the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete.
Yeah. It's interesting as you talk about that in the way that it infiltrated ancient Israel, and it's something that when you read through the historical books, First, Second Samuel, First, Second Kings, Chronicles, and you see the Israelites continually beginning there with Solomon, letting these foreign gods, these false gods, into the temple, into the country, the nation, and erecting high places, as you talked about, all over the place for them, and how that infiltrated the nation. And then we kind of read that today as modern day Christians, and kind of how could they do that?
Yeah.
But then you bring it even into the early church, and saying how they were practicing these sorts of things, even building their churches inside of cemeteries, and then it just kind of makes you wonder. This goes back to what I was saying about a repackaging of the same sort of deceit. Like, what sorts of those practices are being carried out still in the lives of Christians, or in what ways are we still participating in some of these weird rituals and things like that? And I personally think a lot of it has to do with the entertainment industry. I think that there are rituals on display all the time, and I think that from time to time we find ourselves enjoying those rituals and even participating in them in a way that we think this is completely harmless, and this is just a concert, or just a halftime show, or just whatever it is. And really, we are involving ourselves in the same sorts of false worship that we may have witnessed or we read about in the Bible. And I think it's why we have to be so careful, because we do have a very clever enemy out there who is seeking to, as you said, from the beginning of time, has a plan to kind of interfere with the plan of God. Perhaps we shouldn't be so it's always so funny when you're reading the Bible, the Old Testament, and in Exodus, and listening to, how could the Jews, how could they be grumbling at God after all that he's just done? And it's like,
have you ever been to Jordan? Go to Jordan and just imagine having to look at that landscape for 40 years.
Yeah.
Even 40 days. It's like, we've been there a couple of times, and I'll tell you what, there's a reason they film movies that are supposed to be set on Mars in Jordan, because that's what it's pretty much as close to what Mars looks like as you're going to find on planet Earth.
Well, but the point too is that think about how much you grumble. Like, you look at all that God has done for you, and we still find ourselves. So I'm saying we look down our noses at these people. How could they, participate in all this false, idol worship and all of this, and they're so unfaithful and all of that. And now I'm like, we're no different today as modern day believers than these ancient Israelites were. And in a lot of ways, we're still being deceived by the same sorts of things. And that's why I think a lot of the work that you guys do is so important, because there's a whole world of things going on out there that people don't even have any conception of, and we're just kind of going about our daily lives, and we don't even realize that there is actual real warfare going on all over the place. And this is kind of one of the questions that I had for you, going back to kind of the ancient apocalypse sort of thing with Graham Hancock, and he's coming up with all of these interesting theories that kind of go against the scientific narrative, and he's getting a lot of pushback from people, and they're saying his work is dangerous, and they should take him off of Netflix. People don't need to be hearing this sort of stuff. I mean, they're trying to censor him and deplatform him, and it's just kind of really, it's really interesting to me, because he's not even coming at it from a biblical worldview at all. It's one of those things where he's so close to what I believe a proper biblical understanding of ancient anthropology is, but he's still missing the mark by quite a bit. But why do you think it is? He's kind of actually coming at it from a strictly pagan sort of reading. If you were a pagan, you didn't believe in the Bible, then you would believe it as he believes it. So what is your take on the censorship that's going on with him? Why do you think he's receiving so much pushback from the powers that be, or whoever it is?
Well, I think you've got different entities in the fallen realm who are competing with one another for controlling the narrative. It's like politics, human politics. You make it all, the members of one party who oppose the guy who's sitting in the White House right now, but they're fighting with each other to see who'll be the next one to take his place. This is something that Sharon especially has been exploring in her Red Wing saga. She's got 8 novels in the series now, book 9 is well on its way. I'm trying my hand at fiction again, writing a follow-up to the God Conspiracy now called The God Game, and using the concept of the metaverse, although I won't use that name because I don't want to get sued. We'll call it the meta space, as opposed to meat space, which is where we occupy, as a portal for these fallen entities. But there's got to be competition between them as well. And I think it's really interesting that you get a really useful, there's really no better word for it. I mean, from the perspective of the fallen realm, useful idiot. And certainly Richard Dawkins is not an idiot. He's very intelligent. He's just misguided about the nature of creation and reality. Neo-pagans, or rather neo-atheists like Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens, would have loved to see the world move into a new age of reason where we throw off this old superstition of religion and are just totally guided by logic, sort of the Star Trek future, at least until you got to Deep Space Nine, which got all religious again. Which, anything about Gene Roddenberry and his connection to Andrea Puharich and the Nine, these 9 entities from outer space that were, channeling through that group that Puharich led. That's a whole nother story. Anyway, we're not going into a new age of reason, a post-Christian new atheist era. We are moving back into a pagan era. And that's got to be really frustrating for guys like Dawkins, because, and especially I think we should be concerned because the pagans were a lot bloodier and more violent than they accuse Christians of being. They'll keep raising the Crusades and, conveniently forgetting that the Crusades were a very delayed reaction to the invasions of the Muslims in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. And yes, there were atrocities that were committed by people who went out under the the banner of the cross, but were really there to rape, loot, and plunder. The Christian religion has done more to civilize the world and than anything else, really. And going back into a neo-pagan civilization is going to lead to a lot of bloodshed. I mean, we're already seeing it. The number one cause of death in the world, worldwide, annually, is Molech sacrifice. It's abortion. There's no other way to describe it. And I argue that in the book, The Second Coming of Saturn, that even though he is chained in the abyss, according to Peter and Jude, he's still controlling actions, or at least influencing actions here on planet Earth through his demonic minions, just like a mafia boss, who's in prison. That's what we're exploring. We are seeing different fallen entities. And if you want to, talk about the territorial spirits, like in the book of Daniel, where the prince of Persia resisted the angelic messenger who was coming to bring him word from God, resisted him for 3 weeks until Michael, the archangel Michael, came to tangle with the prince of Persia. And then the prince of Greece would come at some point. Okay, who are those entities? Don't really know. We can speculate the prince of Greece was the storm god who became the king of their pantheon, Zeus, i.e. Baal, i.e. Satan. Who's the prince of Persia? Don't know. How does China fit into all this? Who would the prince of China be? Don't know. We see into that realm, as Paul wrote, like we're looking into a mirror in a darkened room, through a glass darkly. But we can speculate, just trying to draw some lessons from the way human politics is just really a clown show at times, that it's probably something like that. But, again, we're just seeing the shadows on the wall and trying to make sense of it. That's about as good as we're going to get until Jesus comes back and restores order and justice. And then, Sharon and I are praying that in that new heaven, that new earth, we get jobs in the archives because we love it. So, okay, how did this really happen now? We want to know. that's what's going on. I think we're seeing spirits in the fallen realm of various ranks and power who are jostling with one another, competing with one another for power as they plot to try to overthrow God and take him off his throne.
Yeah. That's want to come back to that in a second. It's funny that you were talking about your job. A job in the archives would be fun, but I have always wanted to be a herald, and just stand out in front of the throne room and just boast about the king. I thought would be really, really a fun job, but I'll have to come visit you in the archives too. I probably wouldn't be able to stay away from that, given the nature of, kind of my life's work here up to this point. But I was wondering, I was gonna ask you, where is all of this? Where do you see all of this going? You've got a pretty firm grasp on, your own personal eschatology here, and I think you've laid out a pretty good case for it. But and I know we're never setting dates or making predictions or anything like that. But as you're paying attention and looking at the seasons, and the days and those sorts of things, where do you see all of this going in your own personal opinion? And how soon, perhaps?
Yeah, it sure feels like it's going to be sooner rather than later, but time will tell. I mean, in the first century, there were churches that were afraid that they missed the return of Christ already, and Paul had to, calm down, everybody calm down, eat some fruit.
I always think about that because I also am one who thinks surely it has to be in my lifetime. Like, that's kind of like the whatever. It's my lifetime. Nothing special about me, but I'm I got maybe another 40, 50 years maybe. And I'm thinking, surely we can't make it that much longer. But then I remind myself that people have been thinking that for hundreds of years. But
and we talked about World War I a little while ago. And I have to imagine that back around 1918, 1919, people had to think, surely the Lord is coming soon, because we just had 100 million people around the world killed through war and disease. What else?
Especially World War II with the Jews. I mean, you got the Jews being rounded up and everything.
Right. And then less than 30 years later, you got World War II, which left even more people dead through violence. So, and then following that, of course, then you got the Cold War and the threat of nuclear annihilation. Okay, kids, practice getting under your desks for when the nuclear bomb goes off.
Yeah.
I'm old enough that we were still doing that kind of thing in my elementary school. We had the radiation shelters. Everybody go to the auditorium. Okay.
Wow.
And we say this, and while we're saying this now, as we're recording this, just within the last few days, Ukraine has used drones to hit air bases well inside Russia. One of them southeast of Moscow. So,
wow.
Yeah.
I hadn't heard about that.
Three within the last 2 days, and the Russians are not happy about that. Now, they did say, the Kremlin said these are Soviet era jet powered drones. These are not the HIMARS rockets that the U.S. provided to Ukraine. Interesting that as soon as that went out there, the story got leaked to the Wall Street Journal. This is about 48 hours ago. That by the way, we secretly modified the HIMARS so that the Ukrainians wouldn't be able to launch long-range missiles into Russia, which is kind of their way of saying, we didn't do it, we did nothing. But the United States military is facilitating Ukraine in this ongoing war. We're closer to nuclear war right now than we've been at any time since 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Congress is getting ready to pass, as part of an appropriations bill, another $38 billion in aid to Ukraine to add to the $100 billion that we've already sent. We've spent more on sent more to Ukraine since the end of February, that we spent, say, 5 years combined of the war in Afghanistan, which is just mind blowing. And this $38 billion is essentially, not coincidentally, the same exact amount that Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, said he needed to fill the budget hole in the Ukrainian budget. So essentially, the United States taxpayer is now not just sending military aid to Ukraine. We are now essentially paying to keep their government operating. And President Biden says, I can't go to the border. I got more important things going on. Okay, so We're taking more care of Ukraine's borders than our borders here in the U.S., but I digress. I think what we're seeing in terms of this recent collapse of the cryptocurrency exchange and the hemorrhaging of money by the cryptocurrency markets is a push to get people to say, okay, Bitcoin, we get it. Cryptocurrency, we're kind of used to the concept. I mean, nobody carries cash anymore. We all use debit cards. So cryptocurrency or a digital dollar is not really that far away. The New York Federal Reserve Bank just launched a 12-week test of a digital dollar with some really big players, BNY Mellon, a number of other big financial institutions, Goldman Sachs, part of that deal. China has already launched its digital yuan, its own digital currency. The Bank of England, European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, they're all testing digital currencies. I think there are like 24 central banks around the world now currently exploring or actively testing a digital currency. And we're halfway there already. Again, most of us use debit cards as opposed to carrying cash all the time. It's just a small step to say, okay, now you're going to get a digital wallet, and it's all going to run through the central bank so that we can control and, keep it secure. Well, okay, there goes financial privacy. And that would also then allow these central banks controlled by governments to determine what you could or could not spend your money on. I'm sorry.
Or if at all.
Or if at all. Yeah.
We saw in Canada.
Correct. And you marry that to something like a Chinese social credit score, and you've got the mark of the beast, essentially. So this is coming together very quickly. And I think you're right. I'd be surprised if it was longer than 50 years. But, again, all in the Lord's timing. His ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not my thoughts. So whenever. But I think it's really close, because the technology is now there to implement these things, and we've been conditioned to accept them. Since 2001 and the Patriot Act, we have essentially said, okay, for security's sake, we'll give up any pretense of privacy. Everything that you do online is routed through government servers somewhere and stored for future exploration by the NSA if they want. Anybody who thinks that they're doing anything online right now and somebody somewhere doesn't know about it is just fooling themselves.
Not even with ExpressVPN?
No. No. In fact, I just read a story just today about these two crooks in the UK that were trying to ship a whole lot of MDMA to Australia inside a backloader, an industrial digger. And they got caught because one guy used an encrypted chat app, supposed to be secure end-to-end encryption of his dog to his partner in crime. And police got a look at it and saw the dog tag. Oh, it's got a phone number on it. Okay. And from that, they were able to figure this out. The Australian police intercepted it on the back end. And this was an encrypted app. So no, anything that we're doing through the internet, whether we think it's private or not, it's not. It's just not. So the technology is there, and we're being conditioned for security, for convenience, for whatever, to accept this kind of government intrusion in our lives. Sharon, in her novel The Armageddon Strain, which I borrowed some of the plot devices for my novel The God Conspiracy, with the imposed vaccine. There are those who were concerned that the similar events that took place here over the last few years were the mark of the beast. I think it's cryptocurrency, and specifically central bank digital currencies will be the mark of the beast. In my follow-up book to The God Conspiracy, The God Game, I'm having the antagonist of the plot basically say, well, that was obsolete when they first rolled it out 20 years ago. Digital currency, that's the way. How do you prevent people from buying and selling unless they have the mark and worship the beast? Through the currency. So, and we're getting close to it.
Yeah, it's moving toward everything complete. You're going to have an omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent entity, mimicking God that can be everywhere, that can know everything, that can essentially control everything. And it is, the stage is being set for someone, a man of sin, to come in and take the reins of that whole thing and set himself up as a god. So yeah, as I continue to see, these technological advances increase, I am just more and more looking at, oh wow, this could all get turned around on us very quickly.
I agree.
And in the same hand, I'm still enjoying all of these conveniences. I have my debit card actually here just recently has been it's old. It's all jacked up. The chip doesn't work in it anymore, and the barcode is all messed up. And I've just been paying for everything with my phone. And I'm like, oh, this is so easy. I love this. Why don't I just put a little chip right in my hand, and then I don't even have to carry my phone around?
There you go. Yeah.
I'm almost there. So yeah, it is. It's looking, I don't know, exciting, I guess you could call it, scary. I don't really know. When you start to think about all these things, I got two last questions for you here. One, how do you stay, how do you keep from falling into despair, looking at all of this? And then what do you do with all of this information? You were talking about show me your eschatology and I can tell you your theology. So how do we stay not depressed? And then what do we do with all of this information?
Well, Sharon is really good about talking me in off the ledge when I get really frustrated about the way politics are going. But the older I get, and I'm old enough now to remember that I've heard plot changes over the years. For example, when President Bush, George W., came in and talked about not nation building, and suddenly we were nation building, and then talking about Democrats spending and taxing and spending, and then suddenly compassionate conservatism, and we're going to start paying for all of the prescription drugs under Medicare. It's like, wait a minute, this is the largest expansion in government spending since LBJ. What? This is like watching pro wrestling when the guy was a good guy one week and then suddenly he turns and now he's a heel. What's going? Mm-hmm. This is we've seen this a number of times here. I mean, you're old enough to remember when the Democrats were defending Russia because they were proposing the same sort of socialist programs as the Russians. Now suddenly over the last couple of years, ever since Trump came out and is asking questions, really should we be doing this thing over here with our soldiers in Syria and now suddenly anyone who the head of the House Armed Services Committee suggested that even calling for oversight in the billions of dollars that we're sending to Ukraine was Russian propaganda. Like, wait a minute, and this is from a Democrat? So you just have to step back and remember, politics, no matter what nation you're in, politics is professional wrestling with better clothes. That's really what it is. They're putting on a show for the camera, and as soon as the cameras are off, they're going out for drinks with each other and laughing at the rubes who think it's real. That's seriously, that is what it is. It's pro wrestling with better suits. And then go to Psalm 2. Go to Psalm 2 and read it. Memorize it. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens laughs. Amen. The Lord holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. So this is the thing to remember. When you see all of this stuff, like, oh my gosh, how can the Canadians do this and freeze the bank accounts of those poor truckers? How can the January 6th protesters? Yes, these are injustices and we should work to rectify them. But remember, at the end of the day, the politicians, the oligarchs who are making this happen, those poor idiots think they're winning. Psalm 2, verse 4, he who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in derision. This is the one who spoke the universe into existence, and if you've accepted Jesus Christ, he's got our backs.
Amen.
Now, we can look at the world around us and understand why the souls under the altar in Revelation 6 are crying out, "How long, O Lord?"
How long?
Remember, he said, "Vengeance is mine. I will repay." That's sometimes easier said than done, absorbing that and really believing it. But that's how we keep from going crazy. The Lord holds them in derision.
Yeah. I'm excited now. You got me fired up over here, Derek.
Well, give my wife credit for that. She's the one who keeps pointing me back. Derek, Psalm 2. Okay, yes.
I like it. I'm going to add that to my daily meditation. Well, for those who don't know, tell them where they can get a hold of your work, your latest. I love the 5 and 10, by the way. It is there's a lot of news out there, but man, you just get to it quick. It's concise. It's informative. I really like it. But that amongst all the other things that you're doing. So tell the people where they can get a hold of that if they don't know.
Well, 5 and 10 is out Monday through Friday. That's available through Skywatch TV. You can see it at skywatchtv.com. Skywatch TV's Rumble channel, rumble.com/Skywatch TV, or by getting the free Skywatch TV app, and you'll find links for the app stores for your various devices at skywatchtv.com, or Roku, Apple TV. Skywatch TV is there as well. That gets all of the video content right to you and bypasses the gatekeepers of big tech. Skywatch TV is on YouTube, but the daily news content will not be on YouTube, because I'm sure that at least 3 times a week I say something that would get the YouTube channel killed. and it can be frustrating because, that's a Mars Hill opportunity, but I'm not going to stop talking about various things that would get the channel pulled by the gatekeepers. So, I'm not trying to do it to be spectacular or to get clicks. And I don't speculate on things if I don't have any evidence for something, I'll say I'm speculating here. Sadly, there are folks who are getting lots of clicks by throwing stuff out there that there's just no evidence for. Here's a pro tip. Don't get your news from TikTok. Just saying. Stuff that Sharon and I do is at gilberthouse.org. Gilberthouse, all one word, .org. We also have an app. It's the same company that developed the Skywatch TV app. And that's where you can find Unraveling Revelation, my weekly interview podcast, A View from the Bunker, PID Radio, which our old podcast from 2005. We have brought it back, so we've got a couple episodes out there now. All of that content, video and audio, is on our app as well, also Roku and Apple TV. But the links for all of those things are at gilberthouse.org.
All right. Well, there you have it. Derek, thank you so much. This has been such a pleasure, such a treat for me. As I told you, been a long-time follower of your work, so this has been really, really fun. I appreciate your time so much. Thank you. And I just got to ask you, what do you think the Cubs' chances are this next season? I mean, what do you think? Well, I didn't even tell you earlier, but this was the first season, I think, in my entire life, when you were talking about kind of backing off of sports, that I did not watch a single game last season. I couldn't believe it by the time it got to the end. And of course, after they fired the whole roster the previous year, I was like, I don't even care, you guys. But
there were some fun stories there that, I really enjoyed the story of Frank Schwindel, who got a chance at the age of 30 and hit the cover off the ball last year. Sadly, never really going this year. Patrick Wisdom, who, again, he strikes out a lot, but when he hits the ball, it goes a very long way. So kind of a nice story to see some of those guys getting a chance in their late 20s, early 30s to make it to the big league squad. But next year, I think a lot of it depends on, if they got Cody Bellinger, they've got a bat that they needed for sure. Looks like they've got the outfield position set with Ian Happ and the player they brought over from Japan last year, whose name I'm not going to remember. But they do need some. They need some bats, and they need a closer.
We have always needed a closer.
Well,
the Cubs have always needed a closer. Chad Chapman there to.
They've had some guys over the years. I have to remember Bruce Sutter before they let him go to the Cardinals. Lee Smith, Wild Thing, Randy. Oh gosh, no, it's not Randy, but Mitch Williams. Who was Sometimes intentionally wild, I think. Guys never dug in against him because they were never quite sure where that fastball was going to go.
Farnsworth, too, there for a little while. But anyway, we're getting... I just want to know, give me a percentage. Are we making it to the playoffs?
If the Cubs make 81 wins this coming year, unless they couple signings, because there's some talk that they're going after a couple of the big name shortstops out there, Correa or Trey Turner. So, they get one of those guys in there and they slide Nico Horner over to second base. They actually suddenly they're going to look pretty good. They need a catcher now that they've let Contreras, yes, let Contreras go, but they'll be competitive. I don't think they're going to be ready. I don't think they're ready to challenge the Dodgers or the Braves yet. But if they can be 500, maybe they can sneak in as a wild card and just keep life exciting.
Yeah, but more importantly, what are my chances in the Naked Bible Fantasy League?
Well, my secret this past year for finishing in third place was to not attend the draft at all. Just let Yahoo draft. Heiser very conveniently scheduled the draft for when I was speaking at a conference.
Oh.
So, yeah, I'm like right there and just sweating bullets knowing that the Yahoo, but actually Yahoo did a pretty good job of drafting, better than I would have done. So, we'll hopefully an 8th place finish this year.
Yes. All right. That's all I need. All right, Derek. Well, thank you so much for your time. We'll definitely have to have you back on again when Basil's around, but it's been so fun. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Wow, Chris. Simply incredible. Simply unimaginable that conversation could have possibly contained the breadth and width and depth, dare I say, that you and Derek were able to explore. Really astounding.
I'm not even going to respond to that right now.
Of course, come on, you got to keep the illusion up that we didn't simply record the end of the show immediately after the beginning of the show, Chris.
Thank you.
It was amazing. I'm so proud of you, and am also so proud to be part of a project that could simply crack the code, whatever code that needed to be cracked, it is now cracked. And I appreciate that. I think I made the right decision, letting you and Derek do your thing without me.
I'm sure it was a fascinating conversation. I'm bad. I'm bad at putting on. Yes, I'm bad at it.
The illusion. See, and I know you guys got into this during the conversation too, but the illusion of an illusion, we're working in sort of a mirage of an illusion inside of a hall of mirrors right now, where the people now have the impression that I didn't listen to the whole thing before recording this outro. But did I? Didn't I? Nobody will know. But either way, whether we are recording this outro immediately after the intro or not, it doesn't make any difference because it's the same either way. It was a life-changing experience for all of us.
You're living in it.
Exactly. I think that's very relevant sort of mind experiment, considering the concept of
this feels like a Christopher Nolan movie right now.
The mindset of prophetic scripture. It is. So it is written, so it shall be, not yet come to pass, yet passed already ith. I accidentally stopped the recording for a second and I had to pick it up. So if you want to make your funny Christopher Nolan comment again, we could get it in the podcast.
I said this is turning into a Christopher Nolan plot here.
See, even more so. Even now, having you repeat that, it just plays into the whole concept.
I'm losing my mind.
It's turtles all the way down. Yeah, I don't even know. We've really lost the plot on the end of the show here. But the point is, thanks everybody for listening. If you have any questions or comments or guest requests or anything like that, go ahead and send us an email at contact@ravelpodcast.com. Contact@ravelpodcast.com. And don't forget to go leave us some ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. That's very helpful. Helpful for us, helpful for other people looking for good podcasts to listen to. I'm going to just go ahead and search Ravel Podcast on Apple Podcasts real quick to see when the last time we got a review was, because you know how it is, Chris. In this game, you can go through long times. Oh no, the other Ravel was the first one that popped up. We have not talked about the other Ravel in quite some time.
Oh boy.
They changed their logo. Should we just steal their logo? Should we play this game of cat and mouse? They steal our podcast. We steal it back. They steal our logo. We steal it back from them. We've really. I would love to know if they are even listening to this, because of course they know we exist. We show up. We're higher rated. We have more ratings and reviews. And really, isn't that what ratings and reviews are all about? It's about defeating the enemy podcasts. I've once again lost the plot on this outro here.
Completely derailed.
So leave ratings and reviews. It's very helpful to help people distinguish between the original good Ravel podcast and just, I'm not pointing anybody out, but just in case there were some sort of interloper or some sort of podcast thief, it would separate us out from them as well. Yeah, it's 0.6 stars spread right now. I think we can even widen that gap a little bit if we try. Okay, folks. I asked for questions and comments already. I did the reviews thing. Mm-hmm. I think that's basically it. We don't have any other things going on. So thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Ravel. Make sure to tune in next time. But until then, Chris, do you have any last words?
Godspeed.
Thanks for listening to Ravel. To learn more about who we are, what we believe, or how to support this ministry, visit our website at ravelpodcast.com. If you have a question you would like answered on the show, or to let us know how we're doing, email us at contact@ravelpodcast.com. This project is made possible by the prayers and generosity of listeners just like you.